Gary, thank you very much for joining us today. It's really, really good to have you here.
Thank you.
Do you want to give yourself a brief introduction for some of the guys who may not know who you are? Can't believe there'd be anyone here that doesn't, but...
Hi, everybody. My name's Gary Aspden. I work as a freelance brand consultant. I'm retained by Adidas, who I've worked with in varying capacities for the last 20 years. I was an employee for nearly 10 years of that, and I've been working for myself, like I say, on being retained by them since then. I work in two capacities with them. I work on marketing projects, but I also design a range for Adidas called Spexial, which is what I'm wearing right now. So yeah, and I do consultancy for other brands as well. So I've consult for everybody from YouTube to PlayStation. I've done stuff with the Office of Tibet, with the Dalai Lama, just different, whatever kind of takes my fancy really, and pending the time that I've got available. I was a student once. I studied at the University of Central Lancashire. I did a degree in fashion promotions back in the 90s. It was a 4-year degree. It was a sandwich course, and 1 year of that was spent doing internships, which I had to eat a lot of humble pie doing that, because I was doing unpaid internships at the age of 27 because I went there as a mature student. So that's a kind of... Does that explain it?
Yeah, that's perfect. But, we're going to touch on your time in university as well afterwards, cool. Seeing as though we are at Grad Fashion Week. So where did it all start for you? What was it like growing up in Blackburn? Because that's where you're from, right?
I'm from a town called Darwin, which neighbours Blackburn, and I often say that my academic background, what it actually did was validated the experiences that I had prior to academia. As I mentioned earlier, I went to college as a mature student. I guess capsule life story was I hated school. I couldn't stand school. The subject that I loved at school was art, but the school I went to, they weren't particularly supportive of a creative subject like that. It was very much about science, maths, which I had very little interest in. So I couldn't stand school. I left school at 16, got a job in an office, hated that as well. Kind of left after about 3 months before I got fired, and was on the dole for probably about 9 months, something like that. And it was... And then my mum basically turned around and said, either you do something with yourself or you're out on your ear. So I went to Blackburn College and did a foundation in art and design, not really knowing where it was going to go from there. And I chanced my way through that course. It was the only subject I really liked was life drawing, which I was pretty good at. But a lot of that course I was more interested in kind of just going out with my mates and kind of drinking underage or whatever. And so I didn't really take it very seriously. And then at the end of my year there, this is in the late 80s, showing my age now, but it was quite difficult to get on degree courses. And I was having a fling with a girl who was doing textiles, and she said not many men apply to do fashion. So if you apply to a fashion course, you've got a real strong possibility of getting onto a degree, because I needed to figure out what my next move was going to be. And so I looked at the courses, and Manchester Polytechnic at the time was not a particularly great fashion design course. So I applied to Manchester as my first choice. I went along there, bought some new clothes, told them how I'd spent time in Paris and Milan, which was true. I mean, we used to get these Interrail tickets, me and my mates, and go off round Europe, kind of getting up to mischief. So I sort of said I'd been to Paris and Milan, and they offered me a place on this course. So that was in the summer of 1988. I moved to Manchester in August 1988 to study fashion design, and I got a part-time job in a clothes shop called Coral Twigs on Bridge Street in Manchester. And there were two girls who worked in the shop with me. One of them, one girl called Rebecca and another girl called Fiona Allen. And Fiona's a comedian now. She did a TV show called Smack the Pony. But she used to work on the door of the Hacienda. Both her and Rebecca worked at the Hacienda. So I go to Manchester to study fashion design, and they're kind of putting me in front of sewing machines and stuff. And I've never used a sewing machine in my life. I don't really know what I'm doing. But I'm kind of I'm on the guest list for the Aspden every night, so I'm kind of spending more time in the Aspden than I'm spending in college. And after I managed to scrape through on the skin of my teeth and ended up with getting a first year pass on extenuating circumstances. But it was fair to say the lecturers there were absolutely sick to the back teeth of me. And so I ended up dropping out because, like I say, acid house was happening, and I found that far more interesting than what was going on, than sewing machines and pattern cutting. So that's what I did for a few years, and I think that and then I ended up kind of in about 1993, 94, I decided to sort of take off the short pants and put on the long pants. I thought it's time to grow up here, I need to do something myself. So I reapplied to university in Preston to study fashion promotion. And they were like, where have you been for the last 5 years, you know? And so I sort of explained what had gone on, and they offered me a place studying fashion promotion, but I was put on probation for my first semester because of my background. They didn't know if I'd be able to handle being in an educational environment. And so when I got on that course, there was a lot of... I got smart very quickly to it. I treated university like an apprenticeship. I knew that if I didn't make something of that 4 years I had at university, I was going to be going back to the job centre in Darwin and looking at jobs that I really had absolutely zero interest in doing, that were pretty poorly paid. So I took it pretty seriously. I was absolutely driven, to be honest. And my experience of going to college as a mature student was very different to how it had been when I'd been in Manchester in the late 80s. And I started seeing a girl who was in the fourth year, and she graduated. And I spent the summer with her when she graduated. And her year of doing internships, she just got a job in a shop and hadn't really, didn't really have any connections or contacts or any of that stuff. So she came out of university with a load of debt, and she was, she was a talented designer. But I watched her that summer crying herself to sleep because she just didn't know how. She was looking in the back of Draper's Records trying to find a job as a fashion designer, and it just wasn't happening. And I just saw that at the end of my first year, and I thought, there's no way I'm going to be in that situation in 3 years' time. So when I got the opportunity to work, to do internships, I came down to London for a year. Like I said, I was 27 years of age. And because I was as driven as I was when I was in university, I was introduced through one of the fashion design lecturers at Preston to a guy called Kenneth Mackenzie, who had just started a new menswear label called 6876. And this lecturer said, look, you two, similar taste in music, similar politics, I think you'll get on. And so she introduced us, and he introduced me to a friend of his called Jethro Marshall, who worked at Diesel. Diesel had just set up in the UK. So I got my first internship in the press office there. And it was such a new environment to me from the background that I had. And then from that, I could sit here all day, but there were some bizarre twists of fate, and through those bizarre twists of fate, I ended up being offered an internship working as the assistant to the head of press at Giorgio Armani, and that was based in Knightsbridge. I've got some funny stories about that one, but what happened was I was kind of like this woman. I was like her pet northerner or something. I said, do I not need to get a suit? And she's like, no, come as you are, So I go kind of bouncing into this office in Knightsbridge with kind of trainers and baggy jeans on, and so I stuck out like a sore thumb, and especially with my accent. And so I got to know the girls who worked in the Donna Karan press office, who were in the same building. And when I finished at Armani, I went and did an internship there as well. But, whilst that's going on, I'm working part-time in a clothes shop, and I'm eating out the bargain freezer at Iceland, and I'm living in a tiny bedsit in Haringey. It wasn't an easy time, but I was focused on what I wanted to do. And so what happened then, it's a bit of a long-winded answer this, but I'll stay with it anyway.
It's all right.
So what happened then was I had to go back to do my final year. Now, the thing I didn't talk about was prior to leaving school, I was into hip-hop. When hip-hop first hit the UK, I was really into hip-hop. I was a b-boy, and we, the crew that I danced with, we kind of ended up becoming the best in Lancashire, and then we used to go to Manchester. And
are you going to show us some moves afterwards?
Maybe, but 48, I might kind of, if I'm insured. Yeah, no, but we basically would go to all-dayers all over the country. So Freestyle 85 in Covent Garden, we go to things like the Limit in Sheffield, and so when Manchester went to battle other cities, we were like the younger crew and Street Machine were the older crew. So I kind of, that was part of my, how can I say, initiation into the world of sportswear. I'd kind of started wearing sportswear in the late 70s because we all played football, and I had Adidas kick and I had Adidas Beckenbauer football boots, and my mum used to get us these Adidas Europa t-shirts out of the Grattan's catalogue. And so my first really great, I remember my mum getting us a Nottingham Forest kit. I'm a Blackburn Rovers supporter, but she got us a Nottingham Forest kits in the late 70s because my dad was obsessed with Brian Clough. So I remember that being like this amazing football kit. I'd had like an Itchy England kit by Admiral before that. So I started to, that was my introduction to sportswear. But as it got into the 80s and I started to buy my own clothes or acquire my own clothes through friends of mine or whatever, sportswear was such a big part of that. And so I got into hip-hop and I got into b-boying, and one of the guys who used to dance with Street Machine was a kid called Evo, and Evo was a little bit younger than the rest of Street Machine. So his mum wouldn't let him out a lot of the time. He lived on an estate in Urmston in Manchester, but Evo was an incredible dancer, incredible. And what happened was, in 1986, the whole b-boying thing kind of died off and rap became popular, and I went to all those early rap shows, like, the first time Run DMC and the Beastie Boys came to the UK, Public Enemy, Eric B. and Rakim, LL Cool J, all that. So I was around all that. But like I say, I'd for years previous to that, I'd been a b-boy. And so, like, for me, the energy of b-boying kind of went into raving and acid house. The thing I didn't mention was Blackburn became the epicentre of acid house because that's where all the illegal warehouse parties took place. So back to Evo, I bump into Evo out of the blue, and he is basically, where we all got into partying, he got into kickboxing and stayed extremely fit. So when the b-boy thing took off again in the early 90s, he basically started dancing again and was arguably number one in Europe. He was certainly up there, and he's retired from dancing now, but he's like a legend with it. Like the UK B-Boy Championships, it was like a given that he would just win it every year. Do you know what I mean? He'd just come there and win it, and then he just said, like, I'm done with it now, I don't want to do this anymore. But I bump into Evo, and he's like, so what are you doing these days? And I'm like, well, I'm at college studying fashion, and I've been doing internships in London. He said, so do you know people in brands? And I said, well, a few, yeah. He said, well, do you think you could get me some free clothes? I'll wear their stuff. And so I said, well, I can see. And I'd met a woman who worked at Adidas. And so I hooked him up with Adidas. And then what happened was he won the UK B-Boy Championships, and he was approached by the Prodigy to go on tour with the Prodigy. So just before the Prodigy would come on stage, Evo would run onto the stage and do some crazy power move to get the crowd worked up, and then the Prodigy would kind of come on. And he was, and he was also doing a video with them. So through that, I then hooked this woman at Adidas up with the Prodigy. So she then said to me, if you can hook me up with musicians, I will give you free trainers. So I thought, well, I'm broke, I'm in my final year of university.
Very good deal.
It seemed like a really good deal to me at the time. Anyway, what happened was the woman who was hooking me up with this stuff, for one reason or another, left or lost a job or whatever. And Adidas had all these unfulfilled order sheets with my contact number on. So Adidas ring me up thinking I'm some sort of like big shot music manager. Do you know what I mean? And I'm like, I'm a student in Preston, you know. And so what happened from that was they said, "We'd come down and see us." They said, "We don't want to advertise this position because it's a tricky position to advertise for." It was a position called entertainment promotions. Now, putting this into context, this is in the late 90s. In the late 90s, sportswear brands operated in a very different way to how they operate now. There was no hype beast, there was no high snobiety, there was no hype sites, there was no, you know, there were a few people who were kind of chasing around trying to find dead stock product. But the brands themselves hadn't really embraced fashion and lifestyle in the way that they have now. And so...
well, I remember a story you were telling me last time about Jamiroquai and how he almost had to fight to get shoes. And that seems something that celebrities do not need to go through these days.
No, they really don't. But the thing was, Adidas was not set up for this. Adidas was like a very conservative German sportswear company. So, you know, my first day at Adidas, I just felt so like a fish out of water, really, because I'm being introduced to all these guys who sort of like, they speak like sports commentators and they've got their kind of chinos pulled up a little bit too high with their laptop bags. And it was, you know, I'm like, they were coming from quite a different place than I was coming from. And the role of entertainment promotions within the company at that time was seen as a bit of a joke role, really. And so once I got, you know, I still own I've kept the letter which offered me my first position at Adidas, because I remember it coming through my door and just like, because for a kid like me who kind of begged, borrowed and stole to get a new pair of shoes as a kid, it was like, oh my God, this is like letter-headed paper from Adidas themselves, you know what I mean? I was like, so I was so excited to get the opportunity to work with a brand like Adidas. And you know, like, fashion interests me, but I'm not a fashion guy. I'm not one of them guys who sort of like has no objectivity around fashion designers, who's you know, like that whole kind of catwalk circus of fashion where it's kind of like whatever that designer does must be amazing. I don't buy into that in the same way. You know, my interest in fashion really comes from culture and how fashion pertains to culture. I'm far more interested in music culture than I am in fashion, and so what I did when I got the job, I just used a lot of common sense and I strategized that role to make it understandable to people who didn't share the same reference points as myself. It's because when you work inside big brands, it's kind of like part of the challenge is not just what you do outside, but it's also what you do inside, and getting people internally to understand what I was trying to achieve.
Essentially, what you did kind of pioneered a change within sportswear, because it kind of brought musicians and celebrity kind of status to sportswear and kind of made that link in between them.
Well, yeah, but I mean, that link had actually been made way before me. In the 80s, Adidas in America signed up Run DMC, and it was like a phenomena. But then in the late 80s, early 90s, Adidas kind of really lost direction and they didn't know what they were doing. And then they were taken over in the early 90s by a French entrepreneur who basically changed the brand mark and said, we have to go back to what made Adidas great in the first place, which is where Adidas equipment and that sort of return to performance came from. So when I first joined Adidas, fashion and lifestyle was almost like a bit of a dirty word. There was no originals division at the time. They made stuff like Gazelles and Superstars, but it wasn't like it is now, you know. And so I made it, like I say, I kind of, it's about trying to educate the people you work amongst as well. And so I did a bit of a job of doing that. And all of a sudden they were like, oh, hang on a minute. This is, you know, we've got something here, you know. And I remember working on, God, it's like the first Micropacer reissue, and it was a numbered shoe. And at the time, Adidas had a very strict directive, which was for PR. We do not send product out unless it's going into sports-related requests. Now, I knew people who worked at the Face magazine, and I knew people who worked at ID, and I knew people who worked at Dazed. And so with the micropacer, I kind of went round the back and sort of went to a friend of mine at the Face, you can have these and put them in the magazine exclusive. They put them in the magazine exclusive, and then all of a sudden it's like you've got a queue outside Offspring in Covent Garden, and Adidas are going, what's this? And you know, it sounds crazy now to people who are growing up with the way sneaker culture is now, but it was, you know, it was quite a thing at the time. And
I think I just want to touch on something before we go too deep into Adidas. And that's something that I didn't know about you, is that you were such an old student. I think that's really inspiring for a lot of people in the room. That I know a lot of people are going to be quite young, but you're not always going to get it when you straight come out of uni. So it's something you have to work for a long time. Especially with me, I've been in trainings for a few years now, and it's the experience you get over those years which gets you the positions in the company. Sometimes it's nice to come out and have that fresh perspective, but I think experience counts for a lot.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was outside Adidas's target demographic when I joined them. You know, I mean, I was, 28, 29 years of age when I got my first paycheck. So, like I say, what I'm trying to impress upon people when I talk about my internship, it's not, I don't want anyone to get the violins out. I'm not saying kind of poor me. I'm just saying that, you know, there's nothing kind of immediate here. And it's about, if you have a focus and you have a direction, and you know, it's like people would say to me when I was at school, what do you want to be when you're older? What do you mean, what do I want to be when I'm older? I've got no idea. I want to stay in bed. I don't know. I've got no idea what I want to be when I'm older. You know, my brother, he left school. He knew what he wanted to be. He wanted to study law, and he wanted to be a barrister. And he got into it, and he was driven. And I was kind of drifting around, going to kind of hip-hop jams and acid house parties and football matches and all that. You know, but those experiences in many ways have informed my career equally, if not more so, than my academic background. But I have to say, I'm not denouncing academia in any way, because I really have noticed over the years the people that come in that have actually demonstrated they can apply themselves and do a degree, there tends to be there's something about that. It's just that, you know, like, if you stay in college, if you turn up, you're going to get a degree. You might not. I got a first class honours. No one ever asked me that. I've never had to show anyone my certificate. I could have been lying for the last 20 years about it. You know, any chance I get to tell people I got first class honours, I do. I got first class honours because I kind of had a lot of sleepless nights to get one. But no one really bothered. You know, it's not, at the end of the day, you know, my business partner got a 2-1, and there's things that he does that are, you know, like when we work on projects, he's far more, his skill set, he's got skills that I really don't have. But, you know, it's, yeah, it's about kind of, you've got to kind of be absolutely focused on what you want to do. And it was especially difficult because, you know, as you might guess, I wasn't born with a silver spoon. I didn't have a kind of a trust fund behind me. You know, it was kind of like, I've got to kind of get out there and do this. So yeah.
Obviously, it's all led to the situation and the position that you're in now. You do have what most people can only dream of in terms of your own collection with a brand, you know, so esteemed as Adidas. What or where does your inspiration come from for, you know, the Spexial line?
Massive part of my inspiration is my upbringing, to be honest. I tend to have, there's like a window of experience. You know, my business partner, he says, whatever you were into when you're 16, it's probably the thing you're going to be into for the rest of your life. And I think there's some truth in that, you know, but I tend to draw on that because everything's cyclical anyway. And youth culture has changed dramatically, you know, in so much as when I first started working in the late 90s, all the style magazines would be talking about is, where's the next youth culture coming from? Where's the next punk rock coming from? Where's the next acid house coming from? And I personally don't believe we'll ever see youth culture in that way again, because I believe you need certain conditions for youth culture to be born out of. When I grew up, it was boring. There were 3 TV channels. We didn't have a video recorder. We didn't have a telephone. We didn't have a car. We didn't have central heating. There was 3 TV channels. There's no, the only place you'd find a fast food outlet was in the cities. It was kind of like, the TV would shut down at midnight. It was kind of, it's like, it was like a different world. So for us, music and fashion and football and girls was kind of everything. It was everything. And whereas once you get into the 90s, you have what I like to describe the entertainment explosion. So all of a sudden, you've got gaming, and then you've got social media, and you've got... And so there isn't any boredom now in that way. It's like you've almost got this kind of entertainment overload where you're not, it's like you're not hanging around on street corners anymore. Like, it's like things have changed, and I think so. People are constantly entertained, and so they don't have that same, the thing that youth cultures was born out of. I don't think that those conditions exist in the same way. That's not to say that youth culture doesn't exist. It does, but it's changed form, it's like, so for me, a big part of my inspiration is drawing on, those cool kids that I looked up to when I was a kid. Those memories of those people enjoy with me. I wasn't, famous people lived on another planet. You know what I mean? It was so far removed from where I was, and so. And there wasn't media in the way there is now. So, fashion for me was kind of street fashion in the truest sense. It's like stuff that you saw happening at the youth club or the football match or the old day or whatever it might be. So that is a constant source of inspiration to me. And there's a window of Adidas design which kind of begins in the early 70s and ends in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, which is the era of the trefoil. That's my period that I draw design inspiration from for Spexial. Now, that's not to invalidate other periods of design like the 90s or the early 2000s, but that's a particular era that I personally love and like to draw on. So when I'm going to design a collection, I don't even like calling myself a designer, I call myself a curator. Well, there's the geniuses in Germany basically designed this stuff. To me, calling myself a designer almost does a disservice to people who actually learn that craft of design. What I do is I have a very deep brand knowledge, and I have access to a personal archive and also their archive, and I look for things within that and take that and curate that, and kind of I might change fabrics or I might change graphics, or it's more of a kind of a job of curating rather than designing. Now, there's a lot of people out there who call themselves designers who are actually creators, who just go and buy a vintage jacket and then try and just recreate it. But Alexander McQueen was a designer. Do you know what I mean? Izzy Miyake's a designer. Yohji Yamamoto is a designer. I see myself as a curator who has an incredible design back catalogue that he has deep knowledge about, that he can work with and draw from. And I like to try and join the dots between, the product and culture. I like it to have cultural resonance. And it's funny because, the 90s don't seem that long ago to me, but I get CVs of people who were born kind of, around the time when I started working, and it's really interesting what's happening at the moment, because there's been this real kind of trend for kind of dad trainers and late 90s aesthetic. And it's amusing to me because it's kind of I remember in the late 90s having a stock room full of that stuff to give away to people, and I could not give it away. Nobody wanted it. And one of the things I used to do, I'd go and see, JK of Jamiroquai or Noel Gallagher or whatever, and they'd said to me, I don't care about getting free stuff. I've got money. Buy as many pairs as I want. I'm not bothered about. I want stuff that other people can't get. So what I started to do was I employed some of the things that I'd been doing, because when I was at college, I used to sort of pick up dead stock shoes and sell them on to make money to help me get through college. So I used to sell to the buyer from Brown's Focus in South Moulton Street. He used to come up north, and I'd find, Clarks and New Balance and bits of Adidas and bits, and I would sell them on to him, and they would sell them in Brown's Focus. So I kind of took that philosophy into my professional career, and what I would do in the early days was when I was traveling, I was always looking for dead stock. And the other thing I would do, I would go to the Adidas sales force, but this again is just about hustle, it's about initiative. I'd go to the sales force and I'd say to them, do you have any independent sports shops that might be sitting on old stock? And they'd go, oh yeah, there's, I remember going to one in Kentish Town, right opposite the tube station in Kentish Town.
A Sports.
That was it, yeah. And I'd go up there and I go in and I see the shop owner and I say, so have you got any old stuff? He said, I've got a basement full of it. I said, well, how about this? I'll send you all our latest range and you let me take what I want from there. So I was exchanging new stuff for his old stuff that he thought he couldn't get rid of. And then what I would do is I was sending a package of shoes out to, Noel Gallagher or whatever. I would put a couple of pairs of dead stock shoes in there with them. And I would keep a stock of dead stock in a cupboard in the office. So when people would come in, I had all this kind of dead stock stuff there. And some of that dead stock that I picked up along the way, I'd be like, oh, I love those. I had those when I was a kid or whatever. And I kind of just started just leaving them in my mum's attic. And before I knew it, it's like, I'm a collector. I didn't set out to be a collector, and when I was growing up, nobody collected trainers. Everybody wore them till they fell off your feet. Collecting was not a thing to do. And so I had.
Don't tell Morgan that; you'll be out of a job.
Well, times have changed, like I say. But I was, and then, in 2013. I decided to actually go in the attic and see what's up there. I thought I had about 250, 300 pairs. It turns out I've got about 800 pairs of shoes, because I've been keeping stuff from projects that I've worked on. I started working on collaborative projects. So some of the really early kind of streetwear, sportswear collaborations, like I was very instrumental in the first Bathing Ape Adidas collaboration back in 2003. I introduced Kazuki to Adidas, so then the first neighbourhood collaboration, and then I got involved in things like helping write the plan for Superstar 35. But some of these projects that we did then, it's like, as I often say, life is lived forwards, but it's understood backwards. We were doing this stuff, but we didn't really understand the impact that was going to have on not just Adidas, but the industry as a whole. Superstar 35, I remember I was on a plane coming back from Los Angeles, and I just had this idea about, rather than teaming up with celebrities, understanding that there are certain retailers that have real influence. And so it was I came with this idea of consortium. And so, and that model has been taken by so many other brands now, So it's like, Asics are doing a shoe with Foot Patrol, and there's going to, like that. That has become like an industry standard. But at the time we were doing these things, there's no way you can foresee how big of an impact it's going to have. And now, you have a whole department of Adidas called Statement that's solely dedicated to collaborative products, And Spexial for me was almost like a challenge to me, because I've worked on a lot of these early collaborations, and I wanted to do something that was almost the anti-hero, that was for people that didn't want collaborations. I wanted to make product in its truest sense, where it becomes about the product and it becomes about you attach to that product what you want it to be. So people will say in Adidas, they'll say, oh, it's a terrace range, loads of football lads buy it. So yeah, loads of football lads do buy it, but then I'll get someone like Blondie McCoy from Palace who loves it, and then I'll get someone like a Jamaican reggae artist like Chronix who loves it, or I'll get someone like Atticus Ross from Nine Inch Nails who loves it. You know, it's like, and I like the idea of, rather than being overly targeted, just making products and letting people take that and adopt it to their own personal style.
So just to touch again back on, you know, your own history, and you mentioned before about football being a big part of your life. We know that you're quite an avid Blackburn Rovers fan. Yeah. And that's quite prevalent throughout your collection, because some of the pieces are actually named after places in Blackburn. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you know, Blackburn's in the top 3 poorest towns in England. And when I grew up there, it was a working class town, and now you could argue that it's become an underclass town, because in order to have a working class, you've got to have work, and a lot of the industry's gone. And so I'm incredibly proud of my roots, and so I kind of think, you know, I want to kind of celebrate that in my own sort of small way. So it's kind of like, you know, it's like, why not Blackburn? And so one of the things when you're making products is, if you want to name products, when you're a brand like Adidas, you've got to be absolutely watertight on the naming of products, or people will try and sue. So it's like, you know, I have to come up with names for trainers, and I have to come up with names for jackets and tracksuits. So I think, well, use some Lancashire villages, Lancashire beauty spots or whatever, you know, like, because they generally clear legally. And so it's kind of, but also, you know, my roots, Blackburn, bizarrely, you know, in the 1980s, when I used to go to football in the 1980s, they were incredibly well-dressed. The boys and the girls were incredibly well-dressed. And, you know, that's always been a source of inspiration to me. And, you know, because of, you know, the situation in the 1980s, there was a recession. There was a subculture in Blackburn, and it was like a year or two older than me. Because, you know, when you're 16, the difference between 16 and 18 is massive. You know, if you're 18, you've got your ID and you can get into. It's like, you know, so the generation before me, there was a big thing of, you know, they would go to Europe to find clothes and find labels that people here didn't have. Generally, the more expensive, the better, and would find weird and wonderful ways of acquiring those things. And they would, you know, come back. You know, it's like, oh, such a body's just been over to Switzerland. He's got some bits. So you go round to his house, and there'd be a huge sports bag there with full of Adidas shoes that you just didn't see here. And so there was this really interesting sort of subculture going on at that time that, you know, in many ways has always been a source of inspiration to me. So I kind of like to give a nod to that and to celebrate that. Sometimes I think I almost over-egg the Blackburn thing, but it's all good.
You mentioned that footwear terrace community, and, you know, it's so big. People sometimes don't realise just how watertight that community is. And, you know, do you still draw inspiration from them now? Because you're somewhat of like a cult hero to this huge following of like Adidas terrace footwear buyers. So do you sometimes think back and bear them in your thoughts and trying to bring inspiration from what they represent as well in your collections?
I'm always very careful not to try and mirror the customer. I feel that in a position like I'm in, you can almost educate people and you can introduce people to new ideas. So I try to do stuff that would never alienate that audience, but also might introduce them to things that they've not come across before. So, for example, you know, this jacket came from a collection I did in spring 17. And we shot a film over in Kingston in Jamaica with Chronix. But what I was trying to do, you know, we're living in very divisive times, so I was thinking I want to try and show the parallels between Jamaican style and British football style. And it's kind of, you know, because there are so many parallels. You know, if you look at, go down to Brixton High Street and see the way some of the Rastas are dressed. They dress incredibly, like the clothes they wear are incredibly conservative. It's almost like slacks and Clark shoes and Gabici style tops, but the way in which they put it together is gives it a kind of an edge. And it's very similar with football styles. A lot of the way they dress is quite conservative, but there's something just slightly off about it. And if you kind of know, and you can see people who wear that style, and and the thing I love about it is that it's impervious to trends. It's like skating. It's like skateboarding is not a trend. It might be a trend to some people, and fashion companies go, skating's trendy. But to people who are core skaters, it's a lifestyle, and it's the same with the whole football thing, really. So the way that it has been embraced by that audience, maybe those guys can relate to me in some way because of my background. I don't know, but the way it's been embraced by that audience has been in a very organic way on their terms. So this patch here has a graphic in it, which when I designed my first collection, I sort of said to Adidas, you need a collection to sit alongside all these wacky fashion collaborations that's got a really strong brand identity. So Adidas, when they kind of gave me the green light to do it, I kind of came away and went, oh shit, what does that even mean? Yeah. A strong brand identity. And so I thought about my personal situation, and I thought about where I grew up, how I grew up, the experiences I had growing up, and how those experiences kind of formulated the identity that I have as an adult. And I took that philosophy and applied that to a brand. So I looked at where Adidas started, how it started, and it's a German sportswear company that was started by Adidas. So then I started to look at other parts of German culture that I am a fan of, and there's loads of them. So the Germans, they tend not to celebrate their own culture. Mm-hmm. The only time I've seen them do that was in 2006 in the World Cup. But you've got, Germany as kind of, when it comes to art and music, it's philosophy, it's incredible. Like everything from kind of Gerhard Richter to the Bauhaus to Kraftwerk. No Kraftwerk, no hip-hop. Without Kraftwerk, you would not have hip-hop. You know what I mean? So I started to look at all, and then I started to think about the stuff that I was into as a youth at the time when I got into Adidas. And a big influence on me as a youth was Factory Records in Manchester and New Order. And I started to realise that New Order's language, both musically and visually, was German-inspired. And I started to see that, these places in the north, like Manchester and Sheffield, where they've had these amazing electronic bands come from. Is there something there about the fact they're industrial places that they seem to connect to that very kind of hardened industrial German aesthetic? And so basically that was my sort of philosophy on what I was doing in the first collection. And I saw this picture of Adi Dassler, the founder of Adidas, wearing a half-zip knit, and he had a patch on it, and it had like 3 triangles. And when you design a graphic for a brand like Adidas, you have to give them all your design references because they want to be sure that they're not going to get sued. Yeah. So I sent this picture of Adi Dassler with this graphic that I'd come up with, which was like 3 triangles with 3 stripes under it, and they were like, that graphic is the German Football Association that we've had a relationship with for decades. You can't mess with that. And I was like, all right. So I went away and kind of played around with it and then put a reflection underneath. And then what it came up with, it looked like a modernist version of the Adidas trefoil. Now, I didn't expect that to become the sort of, Adidas weren't looking to create another brand mark, but what happened was I put that on a sweater. And then some Liverpool fans took it upon themselves to recreate that graphic on a banner and took it to all the Champions League games in Europe that season. Next thing, I see on social media some CSKA Moscow fans have created the same banner but in their team's colours. And so I put that up on my Instagram, and then before I know it, it's like I start getting these DMs from like football fans saying, "Do we have your blessing to make a banner?" I'm like, I can't, like, these guys are like 6'4". Do we have your blessing? I'm like, fine by me, mate. So, but it's kind of like so it's kind of very organically took on this very word of mouth. You know, I call what I do with Spexial a mass-produced secret. It's like people who are into it are into it.
Yeah.
And I like that. Do you know what I mean? It's like the anti-hero. It sits out on the fringes. It sits outside of the kind of hype world. It's just got a very dedicated customer base, and I think that's cool.
Gary, me and Morgan could sit here and pick your brain all day long. I'm sure the guys would love to hear some of the stories that you've got, but unfortunately we are out of time.
I can talk.
Thank you very, very, very much for coming down. If you can give us, or give the guys in the room, a very, very brief word of advice for what they want to do going forward, what would it be?
If you're committed to doing what you want to do, then just stick with it. And just remember that the fashion industry, someone said to me in my early days, and it's always stuck with me, it's about 5% people who have actually got talent and 95% people that just want to go to parties. So like, if you're absolutely dedicated to doing this and you want to do this, just stay with it. And it might be arduous at times, but just stay with it. Like I say, I didn't start doing what I'm doing until I was in my late 20s. I was like 28, 29 years of age. So if you're kind of 19, 20, don't use that as a license to think, well, I'll go and party for 9 years now. Like, get on with it now. But yeah, just stick at it.
I think between me and Morgan, I'll let everyone else decide who's going to go to the parties and who's got the talent. But Gary, thank you very much for coming down today. You can get a round of applause, please.